Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. This is the third division of the trigeminal nerve and is important primarily for its sensory innervation of the lower third of the face. So let's get started. The mandibular division. And the mandibular division is the third division of the trigeminal nerve. And just as a reminder, it contains sensory, and remember that is just the same as spinal nerves, general somatic sensation. And it also contains the motor component, and in that motor component is special visceral motor, and that is going to go to supply the muscles of mastication. And remembering that this cranial nerve, the fifth cranial nerve, including the mandibular division, is responsible for the supply of pharyngeal arch structure 1, pharyngeal arch 1 structures. So let's primarily focus on the arrangement of this mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. Now below us here I've got a photograph of the base of a skull. And just to get orientated, we have foramen magnum in the middle here. You can see the edge of the mandible here. You can see we're actually looking sort of at the bottom of the ramus of the mandible. The angle of the mandible is just there. You can see the condyles where the vertebra 1 actually articulates is just here next to foramen magnum. And just in front of us here we can see a series of foraminae. This first one here with the roughened edges is called foramen lacerum. And we won't talk about that at the moment, but that will become more important when we talk about the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. And just out to the lateral and just in front of it is this foramen here, which is foramen ovale. And that is the key foramen when talking about the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. And if you look just next to it or just behind it, and I've accidentally just sort of drawn over it a wee bit there, but you can see just behind it here is a little tiny foramen called foramen spinosum. And foramen spinosum is actually where an artery runs from the outside of the skull here and runs back into the cranial cavity. And that's called the middle meningeal artery, and it's the sort of partner foramen to foramen ovale. So what we're going to talk about now is the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve as it exits from this foramen ovale. It comes into this region, or this sort of area here, and this area here below the base of the skull is called the infratemporal fossa. And foramen ovale and the beginnings of the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve is in the roof. Remember, we're looking at this skull upside down. It's in the roof of this region called the infratemporal fossa. And so there will be a separate video on infratemporal fossa, so please have a look out for that and have a listen to that video as well. But for now, we just need to know that the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve comes out in the roof of the infratemporal fossa, and that's where it starts its journey, and it's dividing up into its various branches. So I've got another picture down here a little further that we can have a look at before we start talking about the actual branches. Here we are here. This is obviously the lateral view of a skull, and there's a couple of key features that we can sort of imagine but can't really see from here. But if I just remind you that foramen ovale would be just deep in there somewhere, and then if I remind you that in the mandible on the medial surface, so on the inside here, so I'll just dot it in here, is the mandibular foramen, and that mandibular foramen is the opening into the mandible where the a canal runs right through the base of the mandible here and has little branches to that canal to every single tooth, and another little part opens out just here and called what we call the mental foramen. So these are the sort of areas where branches of this mandibular division of trigeminal nerve are going to run. And in fact we're going to come back and add to this diagram to show those branches in a little while. So let's talk about this mandibular division and the branches that we find within it. So the mandibular division starts off at foramen ovale. Here we go, we'll draw a foramen ovale in. We'll draw that mandibular division coming out through foramen ovale here. And immediately on its exit from foramen ovale, it starts to send some branches out, mainly laterally, and the core branch here is called the auricular temporal nerve. And that auricular temporal nerve has an amazing little quirk to it. Let's remember, we'll just draw foramen spinosum here, and now remind ourselves that an artery, as I said, the middle meningeal artery, runs up through foramen spinosum like that. So, and this auriculotemporal nerve starts off from the main part of the mandibular division, and half of it goes on one side of the middle meningeal artery, and the other half goes on the other side, and then it joins up to then head out laterally. And this auriculotemporal nerve, among other things, is going to go off towards the parotid gland. And it will take all sorts of sensory parts out to the lateral side of the face. The other part of this auriculotemporal nerve, it has a number of little branches that will go off to some of the muscles that we'll talk about later. As the mandibular division then goes a little further, and I'm talking, 2 or 3 millimeters, it then divides into sort of 2/3, 1/3. I've drawn that not so well. Some towards the back here, we'll call this the posterior here, and some towards the front here, like this. And if these are called the obvious names, the posterior division and the anterior division of the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. I'm just going to write up here just to remind us that this is the mandibular division. And immediately after this breakup occurs, the posterior division will then break up again into almost half and half. And now we'll come across some names that we actually know. The bit to the most posterior part is called the lingual nerve. And the bit that runs a little in front of it, this piece here, is called the inferior alveolar nerve. And we're going to talk more about that later. And this anterior division, just to complete the story, continues on as well. And it gets the name buccal nerve. It's a funny looking B, there we go, buccal nerve. And the buccal nerve will explain where that goes in a little while. So far what you've seen is this initial maybe 6 or 8 millimeters within the infratemporal fossa of the breaking up of the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. Now, like I said before, the vast majority of this breakup is related to the sensory systems. There's only a very small amount of motor that is going to go to the muscles of mastication. And just to highlight it, the motor root of the fifth cranial nerve comes out separately and then joins in just after foramen ovale. And the vast majority of the motor component will run off with this buccal nerve, and those that will have a whole bunch of branches that has the obvious names like temporal branch that runs the temporalis muscle, masseteric branch that will run to the masseter muscle, and a number of other branches running off to the muscles of mastication. A tiny component of the motor part embedded within this sensory will run down with the inferior alveolar nerve, and as we go further down we'll talk about what that does. So here we have the motor and sensory components of the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve and how it occurs in that very first part of the roof of the infratemporal fossa. There's a little part to this story that we need to add. Remember that the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve is going to supply the lower third of the face. And the lower third of the face has a lot of glands in it. And nerve supply to glands is parasympathetic. And parasympathetic is a very special functional component of cranial nerves. And in fact, the fifth cranial nerve has no parasympathetic component with it. We've already been through that. We've said that the only two components to this cranial nerve are general somatic sensation, being normal sensation like pain, temperature, touch and proprioception, and the special visceral motor component that is going to supply motor to the muscles of mastication. So there is no autonomic component. What actually happens is that the autonomic component has to come from one of the other cranial nerves, and then it comes out as a little piece separate to this, to then have its ganglia immediately below foramen ovale, and then the postganglionic fibres hitch rides with these branches, and the vast majority, 99.9%, well, not that much, but the vast majority, actually runs out with the auricular temporal nerve to supply the parotid gland. And this little tiny piece of autonomic has had to be taken from another cranial nerve. And in fact, it is a piece of the ninth cranial nerve that has come down out through foramen ovale to produce this autonomic component for the parotid. And this ganglia here gets a special name. It's called the otic ganglia. So we've now covered off all the functional components and the very first part of this mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. Let's now try and put that story back onto this skull and have a look where that all happens. So we'll just slide that up a little bit further so you can see this skull nicely here. There we go. Now the first thing we need to draw is we've got this foramen ovale just sitting in here, and the anterior division, remember we said that was going to become the buccal nerve in the end, comes forward and down through the infratemporal fossa to come out across the retromandibular pad, across here, and it will supply mainly sensory out here, but remember I said it had a few little motor fibres, and we'll just pop them in up here just so we can see them. A few little motor fibres coming off to supply some of the muscles of mastication. And we'll just write its name out here so we remember it. it's called the buccal nerve. Buccal nerve. Now be very careful, there's a trap for young players here. The buccal nerve is not motor to the buccinator muscle. The buccinator muscle is not a muscle of mastication, and therefore the trigeminal nerve does not supply it. So let's put these other branches in now. The other branch, remember we had the posterior division that runs down here, and then behind the mandible here, we'll have to dot it in. There is a big branch that runs down in the floor of the mouth and into the tongue region, and that branch is called the lingual nerve. And the lingual nerve we'll talk about in a minute, what that supplies. And the other branch runs down here to enter the mandibular foramen, to run through here as the inferior alveolar nerve. And that's where these mandibular division runs. Now, in a separate video, I've explained the innervation of the lower teeth and what these branches actually do and how they supply things. So please, for the actual supply of these nerves, have a look at that separate video. Remember, I also said there was one other branch, the auriculotemporal branch, that comes out sort of out here, and that's the one that has that oh, where did I go there? Let's try that again. And remember I said there's one other branch that comes out here, comes from here, out through and around the back of the temporomandibular joint to supply sensation up here, and that was called the auriculotemporal nerve. And that auriculotemporal nerve has the autonomic component because this is where the parotid gland sits, just behind the mandible here. Sometimes, oh, that's a bit extensive, sometimes it oozes over the front of the mandible just here as well. So that's where that autonomic component, remember, from the 9th cranial nerve, that's where that comes from. So let's make a little list of these branches of the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve and what they supply. Let's start. We'll draw a little sort of flow chart, I think. We start with the mandibular division. From that, it breaks into two parts, the anterior division and the posterior division. And the posterior division branches into two parts. It branches into the lingual and the inferior alveolar nerve. Now, just to complete the branch pattern, the inferior alveolar nerve has a couple of branches that comes off it. It has the major branch, which continues on as the inferior alveolar nerve. It has a small branch that comes off called the mental nerve. And it has another small branch that comes off it called the mylohyoid. We'll just get that O looking good. Mylohyoid nerve. And the anterior division, just to complete the diagram, continues along to be the buccal nerve. Now, blue is sensory in this case. Let's just make sure we remind ourselves where the motor components go. The vast majority of motor component runs this way with the buccal, and it has a whole bunch of branches coming off to supply muscles of mastication. A very small amount of the motor component actually comes to here, to the mylohyoid nerve, and it will go off and supply the mylohyoid nerve muscle, mylohyoid muscle, and the anterior belly of the digastric. So that's where the motor components are. And now what do each of these components the sensory parts supply? Well, the buccal supplies your cheek and gingiva and everything to the lateral side of the molars and most of the premolars. The lingual nerve supplies the lingual gingiva, the floor of the mouth, so gingiva, floor of the mouth, and the anterior 2/3 of the tongue with sensory. The inferior alveolar nerve supplies the teeth. The mental nerve supplies the gingiva and the lips, lower lips obviously, lower lip, on the labial of the lower incisors. So let's just write G for gingiva. And the mylohyoid has these motor components in it that supply these. So that's the sort of branch diagram of the mandibular division of trigeminal. And if we just put in the key anatomical features that would be on this, remember that foramen ovale would be about there. Remember that the mandibular foramen would be about here, and then the mental foramen would be about here. So let's just write those in. This is foramen ovale. This is the mandibular foramen. And this is the mental foramen. And we can have a look at our photographs of a skull and a tick and just remind ourselves of where those foramini are. So this is the key supply features of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. If we go back to our picture of a skull here, we can see the mental foramen is quite clear for us just here, just to remind us. The mandibular foramen would be on the lateral, would be on the medial surface of the ramus of the mandible in this region just here. Foramen ovale is just here, up in the base of the skull at the roof of the infratemporal fossa. And if we go back here, we can have a look at that. Here it is here, foramen ovale. So that's where the mandibular division of trigeminal comes out from. And in fact, in this picture, the spring here that's holding this mandible on is actually tied into the mandibular foramen. There it is right there on the medial surface of the mandible. So the key dental branch, the inferior alveolar nerve, would run from here into there, like that. That would be how the inferior alveolar nerve would run. And then it would continue on inside the mandible to run around and supply those teeth there. Whilst we could draw on here nicely, the auricular temporal nerve would loop around this artery here. Remember, we've just drawn in yellow there the middle meningeal artery, come around the back of the mandible here, and then spread out here. And remember what we said, that one contains the little otic ganglion would sit just in here. There's an otic ganglion right there, and those autonomic fibres would run with this auricular temporal nerve to supply the parotid gland, which would be all in this area here, with autonomic fibres. And remember, the preganglionic fibres for this otic ganglion come from the ninth nerve. They are unrelated to the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve.